going to go ahead and get started tonight. I want to thank each of you again for coming out, especially as we skipped a week. This was our challenge to see how many would actually make it back out to the second session, but on the third week. And so special kudos to those of you who are here tonight. And this is a continuation of the grand calling, an opportunity for us to understand better how to bridge the gap or the chasm that exists between us and our grandchildren with regard to how to best share the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our last meeting 2 weeks ago, we discussed generally the concept of deconstructing and deconverting. And so that will be the way we start tonight is, Gary, could you just provide a brief recap as to what those were about and maybe some action steps related? And everyone should have, by the way, a question sheet so you'll know what we'll be talking about. You can write notes on these, and we'll be going through these, hopefully all of these 10, and then maybe even a chance to have an open mic for your questions later this evening if we do really well on time.
Sure. As a means of review, we had two key words last week: deconstruction and deconversion. Deconstruction is sort of a natural process that goes on with any believer, really, to be honest with you. There's nothing inherently wrong with it necessarily. It's questions that we ask that we need answered on matters of faith. So the younger generations at present are asking questions. Are they getting answers? That's what's the real question here. Are they They're looking at their faith, they want to justify it, they want to validate it. They may have some questions. They may have some questions about culture, about various aspects of culture, and how the church, Christians, react or proactively engage in culture. So deconstruction in of itself is not necessarily a problem, although it can lead, if left unchecked, it can lead to deconversion. Okay? So deconstruction can lead to deconversion, not necessarily, but deconversion is always the result of deconstruction. Deconversion is not having their questions answered, not seeing their faith in action, and believing vicariously through someone else as long as they possibly could, be it a grandparent or a parent, but never really owned that relationship with Jesus Christ for themselves. It may happen more in the head than the heart. And we have a responsibility with other believers to help meet those needs and answer those questions. So deconstruction, deconversion. So the first question is, what action steps could be taken in response to our first session? Well, we're going to analyze, last week we analyzed the culture, I think, and young people's response to the culture. Today we're going to talk about the relationships. So we live in a post-Christian culture. I know 81% of people polled in this poll or that poll, Pew Research or Barna. I know 79, 81% of the people in this country say they're Christian. But I'm having a hard time actually believing that. What is the definition of Christian? Okay. Our behavior does not match the numbers. So we've got some work to do. All right? And one of the action steps that we can be careful of until we get a grip on how to reach this younger generation, namely your children and grandchildren, is this: avoid landmines. Avoid conversational landmines until you're appropriately prepared to deal with them. Otherwise, you're going to possibly have things blow up on you. What are those landmines? Well, there's 5 of them. And the first one is a loss of trust in large institutions. So that's the government, the marketplace, and the church, and the media. Avoid them until you understand what you're talking about, who you're talking with, how they perceive things. There's so many different questions you need to be able to answer before you dive into one of these potentially volatile conversations. Politics is another one. The perceived idolatry of political ideology and politicians. So you're going to have, there's a landmine for you. Lack of trust in institutions, political idolatry as perceived by a younger generation, and then those are the first two biggies. I would say that lack of trust in the institutions is the failure of these institutions to govern themselves, especially in the idea or in the practice of what is perceived racism, racial inequality, social injustice, sexual impropriety, inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. If a younger generation sees those things and doesn't see an institution policing itself, these are kids that came up in the Me Too movement and watched Bill Cosby in court every day. So we have a large, and the Catholic Church, and inappropriate sexual behavior in the Catholic Church, and even in the evangelical church. So, those are landmines. Be prepared to have those conversations at some point, but if you're not, don't bring them up. That's a good action point.
Okay, so as you mentioned a moment ago, we're moving from the cultural context, a general understanding of generational perspective and how just to simply be aware of the differences as an introduction to what we'll be talking about tonight, which are the relational connections or reconnections that we're hoping to achieve. I want to show you two different advertisements. My guess is because of our demographic, the generation that's represented largely here tonight, that these will be familiar. The first is an ad from E.F. Hutton from 1978, and it will relate to our discussion as it deals with credibility and reputation and the earned right to be heard. So if we could play that one, please. So the idea is that when you as a grandparent speak, you want your grandchildren to listen. And that is an earned right, an earned ability. Watching that, I was amazed that was actually done in color. It was that long ago. The next one is in 1984, a Smith Barney ad, and you'll recognize this one also, again, having to do with investments. This is John Houseman in 1984, and I want you to pay attention to two presumptive statements that John Houseman makes in 1984. See if you can catch these. If we could play this one, please.
John Houseman, for the investment firm of Smith Barney. America is returning to traditional values. Good. Smith Barney never left. Their investment standards have stood the test of time. Perhaps that's why their clients stay with them year after year. A return to traditional values. That's progress. Smith Barney, they make money the old-fashioned way. They earn it.
Familiar? Okay. Yeah. The two presumptive statements, he said that we're returning to traditional values, 1984. Good, he said. Untrue, I say. That may have seemed true as we were coming out of the 1982 recession and things were on an upswing or whatever, but I think John Houseman, well, he's probably not around any longer, but probably would agree that we are no longer in a reconnection with traditional values. And the second had to do with that too, that we're moving back toward traditional values, growing toward traditional values. The point of this ad really though is to just simply drive home the fact that we must earn, let me say that again, we must earn the right to be heard, to be listened to. And that's what we're talking about tonight. And if we could put the next slide up that shows a continuum, if you will, hopefully a progression that you can probably place yourself on this progression. This is a positive progression. that shows us moving from in relationship to our children or our grandchildren, we are in one of these likely categories, or maybe somewhere along the continuum of being estranged, meaning that we are disconnected. We don't really have a connection or a relationship with our grandchildren or our children at all. And then external, meaning that we exist, but we exist on the periphery or the perimeter of their lives, maybe checking in once or twice a year with a birthday card or a phone call or two, but we really aren't necessarily involved or engaged. And then third is actual engagement, where we have earned the right to be heard, earned the right to be involved. And we'll talk about what those mean. There's also, we're going to show this one once, but the reverse of this can also occur. Negative digression, where we move from being engaged to actually becoming estranged. And this can happen in a moment. We gain engagement over the progression of years in a long period of time. But this kind of disconnect, where we actually lose engagement by losing credibility, losing integrity, losing connection, that can occur really quickly. So we obviously want to avoid this. And if we can go back to the green slide and just keep that up in terms of what we are looking for and trying to achieve in this relationship. So with that in mind, second question that you have on your sheets with you, but what is, Gary, what is a good starting point from which we can better evaluate our credibility in the eyes of our grandchildren?
Yeah, so it is nearly impossible to answer a question about this subject without taking into consideration the context. How old is the grandchild? I have a nearly 2-year-old grandchild, and I'm mesmerized by her. I stare at her and study her, and my mouth drops open, and I'm so captivated by her. I'm the most engaged human being on the planet when she's sitting in my lap, no matter what she wants. Well, I have a feeling that you probably aren't that way by the time you have a 14-year-old grandson. I don't guess you're doing that. So these things progress or change, they morph, like all of our relationships, based on our context. How often do we see them? How old are they? What are their likes and dislikes? What is our regularity of communication? So we're probably correct, Thomas and I, in thinking that we're either one end of the spectrum, estranged, external, or engaged. So if we're estranged, ask yourself this question, and it might be different for the first grandchild that you have, but the same second grandchild in the same house might be different, okay? So if there was a breach and you're estranged, what was it? And you may not know what it was. You have to find out. We have to find out our starting point to repair a relationship or continue a relationship or enhance it, but we have to know what it is. Are we needy grandparents trying to find a way for someone to love us and want us, or are we somehow a real loss when we pass away? You ask yourself that question. If I was to pass away today, what my grandchildren, would they really lose much? Do they really know me? Do I really know them? Have we lost contact? Have we lost closeness? Ask yourself, you got to know your starting point. So you can't just generalize this topic. You have to know your individual starting point. So if there was something that was a breach or an offense or hurt, let's find out what it is. If there's something we need to be doing more than just being an outside spectator in a person's life, is that a mutual desire? It is your desire. Somebody came up to me not long ago and said, I have 8 grandchildren, I don't even know them. I thought, my gosh, you have to try. That takes effort. You have to make effort, decisions, like intentional decisions to do that. So where are you with each of these, well, your kids and grandkids for that matter, and what are we going to do about it? What is the breach? What is the, if it's external, why can't we have a mutually respectful relationship whereby a teenage grandson, we need to not only just see ourselves as a teacher, we need to be a student. What can I understand about his world more than I do now to better understand where he's coming from? We have to be those people that take the time to do it. I said something, my wife and I talk often about grandchildren and being a grandchild. And she has the deepest fondness for her grandparents, the deepest, most meaningful memories of travel, of literally growing up in their home, of camping together. And I cherish listening to those stories. I love it. And we were putting our little almost two-year-old granddaughter in the car seat the other day, which is getting to be very physically challenging. And I said, were we this way with our kids? And I think she knew what I was talking about, where we just kind of stare at her and we're like fascinated by this human being. She goes, I think we were too busy. We were going a mile a minute. Because I don't remember the fascination, except for when they were first born. I think parenthood and grandparenthood are different in that respect. So think about your relationships with them and think about, where am I? Estranged, external, sort of take it or leave it kind of outside figure, or fully engaged? Fully engaged. My granddaughter reaches up and wants to grab my hand and my wife's hand when we walk down the sidewalk. A granddaughter will want to hold her grandmother's hand at age 8, 9, 10 in the mall. And then it's going to come, the age is going to come when they no longer want to hold your hand. And they may not even be wanting to see it in public with you, I don't know. But we have to know where we're at, okay? We have to know where we're at to evaluate where we want to go. So that's the point there. And we can go backwards in a hurry. In a hurry. Watch out for landmines.
Okay, so recognizing that it is a process and that we have a responsibility to place ourselves somewhere on this spectrum or continuum. In some ways, this actually begins to answer question 3. What do I need to do before I get too far into the process? What are some of the preliminary steps that need to be taken before attempting to speak this truth regarding faith into the life of our grandchildren?
I'll tell you something. This is true of grandchildren any age. Once you actually live out your faith, you have earned the right to speak about it. So don't speak about your faith, or I'm not going to speak about my faith in such a way, if I'm not going to have any desire whatsoever to live with humility or to demonstrate what it means to have Christ in you, the hope of glory. Remember, these generations have antennas that you cannot see. They go out into the solar system and they can pick up inauthentic speech like nobody's business. They have radar for inauthentic speech. If you want to give spiritual platitudes and not live that way, you're behind. You're behind before you ever start. You're not even close. You've got to demonstrate humility, demonstrate confession, demonstrate apologies, demonstrate remorse, contrition, conviction. In fact, you have to walk with a limp. I have to walk with a limp on Sunday mornings when I have to self-deprecate. Usually in any message, I will self-deprecate, meaning I will point out some fault I have or some inefficiency that I have in relationships. Because if we fail to do that, we fail to be relevant and believable. We have to walk with a limp. So before we get into our spiritual platitudes of how, this is the most important decision of your life, let's demonstrate it was a really important decision to us because that's the way we live. Now we've earned it. The old-fashioned way, we've earned it. So anyway, keep that in mind, because estranged, external, or engaged, you want to move further down the highway into depth of intimacy with people in relationships. You want to be that grandmother, that grandfather that God's called you to be. Then walk with a limp and earn it. Already demonstrate what it is you're going to talk about. Don't talk about it and then never demonstrate it. you'll get nowhere fast.
So maybe the idea of less speaking initially, more doing, more living, and living in a way that would back up what it is that we're trying to share in words. We live first by deeds and do that with all honesty.
Okay, well, I got a question for you. Jesus is about to send his 12 disciples out and to start the church of Jesus Christ. If they succeed, his mission is success. If they fail, what do you do then? You can't get crucified a second time. You can't come back and get crucified. The whole Bible is not going to work that way. So what's the last thing he says to them before sending them off? Before he's killed, what's the last thing he says to them? It's the most potent sermon he ever preaches, the most memorable and the most lasting. And he barely spoke a word. He washed their feet. So if you and I can walk with a limp and be foot washers, when you do have something to say, somebody's going to listen. You see that? When you do have something to say, they ought to look at us as grandparents as very unique individuals who do things no one else does, who stand out like a sore thumb, that are so distinctive in their behavior that they'll never meet another person like them. So that when we do go and we have a funeral, they've lost a living example of a foot washer who earned the right to verbalize something. Because he says, go out and tell all the world the gospel. Go share the gospel to the four corners of the globe, but only after you wash each other's feet. That's a very intentional time placement of a foot washing. Serious.
Okay, so to live it before we speak it, to do it even without words, maybe especially without words. And you spoke of the example with your granddaughter Cora, and you have the benefit of working with Cora and establishing this intimate relationship with Cora as she is yet to be 2. Many of us have grandchildren that are older than 2 and maybe on into their teens, and so there's the strong potential that something may have happened prior to this new opportunity for engagement that may have already led to some level of brokenness or disconnectedness, that we find ourselves maybe more toward the external or more toward the estranged. How do we go about regaining or restoring that connection if it may have been broken or breached along the way?
Well, one way, if you had a camera, those TV shows, reality TV, where they film like you at your house, like living your life, and everyone's an insane maniac of some kind. Well, my wife and I, when we hang out with our granddaughter, if you filmed us, you would say, these people are complete idiots. The lengths they go to make her laugh, or the gyrations or the dances that we do, the singing that we do, to be there with our granddaughter is hilarious. But listen, what makes us so distinctive is this: we ought to be people with an incredible sense of joy, right? So as a grandson or a granddaughter gravitates out of grade school into middle school, oh man, that's a phase there, isn't it? They're forming their identity, they're trying to figure out who they are. As they try to lose their childhood, we should be more and more childlike. We're supposed to be old and irrelevant and decrepit and immobile individuals at some point in time. The more a Christian is childlike and not childish, the more we are wanted, the more we're needed in a person's life. We got to be laughing, having fun, laughing at ourselves, laughing at the world, laughing with God, I think that's what makes us relevant as our grandchildren get older and older and more sophisticated and more brilliant and more, I wish I knew 10% of what I thought I knew in 6th grade. I'd be Albert Einstein, for crying out loud. That's what they're going to treasure when they look back at their grandparents. My papa always made me laugh. My grandfather, he had me in stitches so often. I would literally be on the ground laughing so hard. I think we need to lighten up. I think we need to lighten up as believers and just loosen up a little bit and have more credibility. You heard me say sometimes on a Sunday, like, we're supposed to be the people of joy. Make sure your face is informed of that. Like, I see so many tightwads in the church. Like, golly, man, lighten up. You're forgiven of your sin. You're walking around like you're the most guilty person on the face of the earth. You're about to get whipped any second. Like, if people don't smile more often, shoot, I wouldn't want you around either. Some of you, all I can take is a Sunday morning. You're just so uptight. Relax. Our grandchildren need to see us as kids. But, fun. Our whole approach to life is about that. See life through their eyes. And that makes us more relevant. I really believe that. We're always fighting for something or righteous indignation. And the whole world looks at us like, man, you can have that faith of yours, man. You're the most uptight person I know. And we're having cosmic battles half the time. Lighten up. God's in charge. That everything's going to be okay. I think that just approach to life is kind of infectious.
Well, and you mentioned, learning to speak Cora's language, which is smiles and songs and a couple of octaves higher than you normally speak, and dancing around. We were talking about ballet at dinner tonight, and my guess is you've done your set of pirouettes around the house. But you do that to engage and to capture Cora's attention, and she engages back with you. For a 13 or a 14-year-old, it's going to be, I hope, quite different. But there's a relevance that we, I think, have to engage also. And learning to speak Cora's language versus learning to speak a teenager's language.
Yes.
So
but if your teenager's going to a movie and you have no interest in it, and he's 600 miles away, go to the movie. You have something to discuss. I'm going home sometimes. My wife's at rehearsal. I'm watching Sing. Well, I love the end of the second movie of Sing when they have the singing, like the sing-off. Man, you should see us. We all got our hands in the air, and we're watching the thing. We're dancing around, and now my granddaughter's not even there. I'm watching it. Like, I can't afford to be this uptight preacher, and you can't afford to be uptight either. Like, find out what your grandson's into. Ours is into surfing, skateboarding, throwing all caution to the wind in any given moment of any day and facing danger. So maybe I need to find out about that, right? Maybe I need to know the terminology. Maybe I need to see somebody who can actually speak some lingo that he hadn't heard yet. That makes me relevant. And it shows that I care because I took some time to invest in his world, even though we were 500 miles away. That's why I need to go see his movie my grandson's going. I mean, that's an example.
And ours is a little bit different without surf nearby. It's for our 4-year-old grandson, it's snakes and spiders and any creepy crawly thing that he can bring into the house to show mom, which is always exciting. But also imagination monsters and creatures, forts that he can build out of cardboard boxes. And we're often doing this via FaceTime. And so having a 2-inch screen and trying to communicate a sense of real engagement and interest in whatever it is that Ezra is living out and showing with all excitement, it's really incumbent upon us to reflect that excitement back to them.
Yeah.
So,
can you imagine, if my little granddaughter moved away and we got a new refrigerator, I think the thing to do would be to FaceTime her, take the refrigerator box that it came in, make a fort out of it, and have a FaceTime call inside with my wife. I mean, that's kind of how we need to relate to these. We need to do things that are weird, out of the box. And in the box. There you go.
And okay, so for us, the FaceTime call requires, at least for now, that our oldest daughter, make the FaceTime connection. The children wait in anticipation. So there's an intermediary that is our daughter who makes that call, who makes the connection happen. The next question has to do with how important is it? It's not a question of if, it is important, but let's talk about the need to engage perhaps first with our children before we leap over them and try to gain access to our grandchildren.
Oh, yeah, you had to bring that up. Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, parents are parents, right? And they may want to raise their children a certain way, maybe different the way we want it. Have you ever seen the movie with Billy Crystal and Bette Midler? Oh, you got to go see. You got to stream that movie. It's the one about parenthood, and it's the convergence of two generations' ways of raising a child. There's such a dichotomy between the two. I think we have to respect the way a parent chooses to raise their children and realize if we don't like the way our kids raise their kids, we're probably responsible for it on some level. They're probably reacting a different way to their upbringing or something. I don't know. Well, our kids raised their kids differently than we did, but there is a relationship with them that we have to foster, just like we do here. Are you estranged? Are you an outsider? Or are you engaged with your own children, adult children, right? Because that affects our relationship with our grandchildren. And there could be spiritual boundaries set there. And it's this whole thing all over again. Look out for the landmines that are going to just totally blow the relationship right out of the water. Pick your words carefully. You can't just have a relationship with your grandchild where they get on FaceTime and you're wearing some war paint on your thing, you got a costume on, and you're playing some role with the grandchild. You got to have that role with your child as well, the parent, the adult parent. So you may have to go back and fortify some breaches with them before you go forward with your grandchildren. It's the whole Home Alone movie where the guy next door, the curmudgeon next door, has to repair his relationship with his adult children before he can really see his granddaughter. He's got to sneak off to the church to see a choir rehearsal just to see his granddaughter. Well, we got to go back and repair those relationships. And that too is demonstrating our faith, demonstrating. I think our children want us in their child's life, I would hope. And not every relationship that we have is bad. I'm not saying that, but we got to look out for how we can repair these breaches, and be bigger in the situation, or as big as we need to be to do that. And I think sometimes that requires some counseling. If you want to know the truth, there's some counseling situations that come up with relationships with their children, and adult children of parents that, oh my gosh, these have gone on for decades. These are so entrenched. This behavior is so entrenched. It doesn't appear as though you'll ever get out of that cycle. You really need someone else to help you. If that's you or if that's me, I've already demonstrated how good I am of making a repair in this relationship. And if it's been 30 years, I'm not very good at it. Might be time to bring someone else in to help facilitate those things. So, something to keep in mind.
And this is so much like we were talking about this earlier, that I often have projects that I'd like to work on the weekend, and I want to get immediately to the focal point of whatever the project is, as opposed to taking the prerequisite steps to get ready to prepare for the project. And I think sometimes we get so focused on the need or the desire to connect with our grandchildren that we skip the preliminary steps, what we're talking about right now. And that often requires the step back in reconciliation and restoration, and even asking for, literally with the words, will you forgive me? Asking that of the parents. rather than trying to jump over them and get to the grandkids. That act in itself, I think, is important to understand that the grandchildren very likely will be aware. We talk about this all the time. Our 4-year-old grandson sits quietly in the background during phone calls, but he is listening intently to what's going on with our conversation that we have with our children. And chances are, someone as young as a 4-year-old is still going to perceive what's being attempted anyway in terms of the reconciliation, the restoration. And that is a wonderful beginning point as a demonstration, going back to what we talked about earlier, the doing of reconciling, the doing of forgiving, the doing of restoring a relationship with a child in order to gain legitimate, honest access to the grandchild.
Yeah.
So I think that's...
If at any time, if you're honest about it, you've become a wedge without even meaning to be between a child and their parent, or the parent has become a wedge between the grandparent and their son or daughter, oh man, we have got to go back and ask forgiveness for that. I mean, we cannot be seen in any way, shape, or form as someone who's interested in coming between the authority of a parent and their child. That's the kiss of death. You'll be relegated to cleaning up after Christmas, and that's about all you get right there, man. That's it. That's very important. Or it's just like I see this a lot, actually, in estranged marriages where there's a divorce going on and one of the parents has the kids. The temptation to talk down about the other parent is so strong, sometimes people fall to the temptation. And those poor kids are now caught in the middle of listening to their mother downgrade their own father, and the father did the same to the mother. That's just not going to happen. That's estranged to the max. You got to go back and repair that. Even if it's perceived to have happened, you've got to explain where you're coming from.
So I think recognizing the preliminary steps that need to be taken, the willingness to step back and make sure that we essentially are asking permission of our children to be able to, and I don't think it comes in the question of to our son or daughter, do you give us permission to share the love of Christ with your son or daughter, our grandchildren? It's more like asking permission, can we go and do something together? Go to the park together, go get ice cream together, go see a movie together, just to ask for permission from our children to be able to have that access and not just assume it to exist. So I think, just that simple act, it brings the parent back into the part of the process of their part of this too. They're not being overstepped.
Yeah, I think, this is different with different families, but if you're a grandparent and you're starting to gain more and more access to your grandson or granddaughter, and it's like the faith is a big subject, it's a big taboo. Don't you dare bring up anything about faith. You've got to establish a trend and a pattern of being a person who's going to do nothing but support, encourage, and love that grandchild. You could do that. You could do that, speak volumes about your faith. That'll come later. But if that's a taboo in your family, you're really just trying to earn the right to be involved in that child's life. Because, hey, listen, if you're not, that could be really bad in the long run. Really bad. Don't overestimate the effectiveness of Christian schools. And if I showed you the stats on some of that, you'd be surprised. You are a key player in your grandchild's life. Develop a pattern of regularity of investing in their life before you go too fast, too soon, boom, it's going to blow up on you.
So we wrote down the other day just some of the characteristics of what engaged would look like. If we all agree that's where we would like to be, if we're not, but if you are, these following characteristics might sound somewhat familiar or hopefully at least desirable. That we in this relationship as grandparents would be relevant, that there would be respect, mutual respect, grandchild to grandparent, grandparent to grandchild, there would be a give and a take in the relationship, not just me giving information or sharing a wealth of wisdom that I know I have, and I'm just going to bestow that upon the grandchild, but to listen, that there's a depth. You're not just talking about superficial things. That might be a great way to engage initially, but eventually, and this is what we're going to start talking about here in just a moment, getting into some of the deeper issues of life, and not necessarily just as it relates to faith, but being able to talk about the brokenness of life that surrounds us, that we hear about, we witness all the time, on the news or otherwise, that there is real and meaningful communication, and in that communication is honesty, integrity, and contrition, some of the things that you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously those are different depending on the child and the age, the gender. I mean, there's so many things that relate to this, but is there an ideal target time to try to engage with or interact
I
with?
think what we're looking for, and it's just like, we're talking like these about children, but it's true of any relationship. What we're really looking for is that someone to share something with us of the heart and trust us to keep it to ourselves. That we are a safe person, a safe confidant to talk to. It can be, and you'll know you arrived as a grandparent when your grandchild is sharing something with you that they perhaps have not shared with anyone else, including their parents, and you have been perceived to be a trustworthy friend. Now, your response may be, I want you to really consider, if not pray about, sharing that with your parents. But once you've arrived at that, once someone, like in my role here at this church, once someone comes to me and they share something that no one else knows, like I have a file cabinet in my head of the underbelly of Highlands cashers, the wealth of private, confessed, and gross sin. All right, once you've deemed yourself worthy of being safe with that information, then you're engaged. You're engaged. And that's really what we're earning here. Now, that has to be you have to be so safe a grandparent that could be something that you don't want to hear. I'm having some issues or confusion about gender, attraction to the opposite sex. I'm having difficulty with drinking. You see, if you have loved that child and limped in front of that child for years, you have earned the mutual respect, and that they may not share with their parents because they feel like it might be punitive. That's engaged. That is a parent who is a grandparent. That's trust, and there's not a lot of trust in this world. So that to me would be an indication of a lifelong, unconditional love. You might not like what you hear, but it's better they share it with you than no one. And it may be, I'm sorry to say, it may be that I'm having thoughts of taking my own life. I'm having this. This is what I'm dealing with. And thank God they have somebody to talk to. I, in a way, am a grandparent to some kids in this community who have shared things with me that their parents aren't aware of. And thank God they had an outlet. Had they not had an outlet, who knows what that would have, who knows where that goes. So grandparent it can be a heavy thing, it can be a heavy thing. But you gotta earn it. You gotta earn it. And obviously turn them back to their parents. Hopefully that's the thing.
And so that would be a true example of having earned the trust or the willingness of the grandchild to share things that might not have otherwise been shared. What do we as grandparents have as a responsibility in terms of a willingness to discuss some of the harder, tougher issues of life that we have either already experienced or lived out ourselves? You know, divorce is rampant. Infidelity is an issue, all too familiar. What responsibility do we have to bring those tough issues into conversation if we're going to be honest with our grandchildren?
I think you don't waste those opportunities prematurely. You don't talk about them just to talk about them. You have a story when you were 13 and infatuated. You have a story of I don't know, maybe you got pregnant out of wedlock, or maybe, I don't know, you went too far. Who knows? You don't just share those things to share them, but if the relationship is a mutual respectful relationship and you are a needed person in that grandchild's life, they may more likely come to you because you've limped in front of them before, and you can say, I understand. I've been where you are, and it could be addiction, it could be, I don't know. That's part of our role. We may be more approachable than mom or dad. At those times, I think, is when you really need to make the decision, is this something I share now? And if so, it would be for the benefit of the child, as opposed to saying something early on when it's not even relevant. It actually could do more harm. Like they could identify, well, you did it, so I'm gonna do it. But if you want a mutually trustworthy relationship with somebody, you're gonna have to give something back that you necessarily maybe didn't want out. And you're gonna have to trust them with it. And treating them with that kind of respect never really blows up on you, because you're showing them that you identify that they're responsible enough to handle that situation. Also, if you find out that there's behaviors going on with your grandchild that you pick up on or you have an idea about, become a student of that. We've seen this happen in this community. Kids are cutting themselves, or there's some suicidal ideation, or there's this attraction, or she's going too far, sexual promiscuity or something. School up on it. Like, become an expert on it. Doesn't take long. And be able to hit some of that stuff off. Listen very closely. They'll tell you what's going on because they need help. They'll tell you if you listen carefully.
So a profound difference between speaking on a topic empathetically, either because we have experienced it perhaps ourselves and can identify, or that we've taken the time to learn enough to be able to speak to it with some reasonable understanding, it can seem like a vulnerability at first, but it can often lead to inroads that wouldn't exist if we, instead of speaking empathetically, we speak judgmentally.
Yeah.
Or in a condemning way toward a behavior and just say, it's wrong, and then we slam that door shut.
Yeah, I always think of movies. Forgive me. It was a movie about marriage. It was the Christian movie about marriage, and the fireman came to Christ, and he had the 40-day thing. I don't know what it was called. Well, Fireproof. Well, the father had to share something of his own life about his failure in marriage with his son at a strategic point in the son's growth, and the son had blamed the mother the whole time, and it was the father's undoing. And it was such a strategic point that it was effective. If he had shared that 10 years earlier, wouldn't have done anything. You got to save those things up to really minister to somebody.
This past Sunday, you spoke on a powerful topic related to blessing and communicating and sharing a blessing with a child or a grandchild. which for me is just one of the strongest ways of sharing an encouragement, a positive word spoken over someone. What are some things that as grandparents that we need to keep in mind, just in the background as we engage in this conversation and this relationship? What role does the blessing have in this overall relationship?
Well, let me preface that with saying I've failed at this miserably. I have failed. I have not taken advantage as a father of the power of blessing. And for that reason, I'm quite acquainted with its power, for failure not to use it. And when you have grandchildren, you find yourself now like reevaluating. Would I approach something differently with this grandchild that I did with my own son or daughter? And can I go back and still speak that blessing? To speak a blessing over another person, you have to actually possess a blessing to give it away. There's Genesis 27. Jacob disguises himself to steal his brother's blessing. Sometimes we disguise ourselves in life to be blessed by the Father. We act a certain way, look a certain way, treat ourselves a certain way, thinking it's going to bring a blessedness onto our life. That's not right. If you're a blessed person in a relationship with Christ, you have something that must be given away, because it wasn't given to you solely for your own purpose and enjoyment. It was given to you to give away, just like Jesus was. So, as an authority figure, to lay hands on one and impart to them something you already have, to God, is a pretty important thing. To us, I think we've missed it. I think it's a cultural miss. It's a 3-2 count, standing up, the pitch comes, and we don't even swing, and we strike out. Called third strike. We miss the power of blessing. To have the blessing, the favor of God, to lay hands on his grandson, and they understand that you're giving something to them that you have been given yourself. One, it'll further solidify that blessing in your own life, and it will remain on that child. In God's eyes, it has, as I said Sunday, it has a beyondness to it. The blessing remains on the child. Circumstances may change, but the blessing remains. And God brings about the blessing. It's like a mobile prayer through the decades. Even in our absence, the blessing remains. I think this is something we need to really get more familiar with and study more and act more. We are missing something huge here as it pertains to generational, a mantle of generational favor and blessing of God. He came up with it. He came up with it, not us. And we're not actually even putting it into practice, and he came up with it. That's a problem right there. That's a problem. Like, our opinion matters in the matter, you know. So sometimes we disguise ourselves for a blessing, and sometimes we get blessings in disguise. The things that you and I have encountered in life, the difficulties and the trials that we have encountered, oftentimes we look back on them and say, those are blessings. If that had never happened, if I hadn't, this had never taken place, I never would have done this, I never would have been here. So I think, I'd remind you that tonight, as I did to the men on Tuesday morning, go to bed tonight, but thank God for your blessings in disguise and the blessings that you're not even aware of. The accident you never had, the person that never broke into your home, the disease that passed over your family, the financial calamity that never came your way because God protected you. Blessings are everywhere, and sometimes we can't even see them or know they exist. But I want to encourage you to get on board with, in short order, opening your Bible in your chair at home with your cup of coffee like I am, and really asking God about the power of blessing. Because it's a power greater than the world, greater than our grandson or granddaughter's opinions or knowledge or lack thereof. It's power. It's resident power spoken by an authority who owns something, who gave it away, received from God and gave away. You know, God still has it. It's not a different person. We need to take a look at that scripturally, and we'd be surprised how destiny changes for certain people.
And I think sometimes it's important to recognize the blessing doesn't always have to seem to be sacred in nature. It can actually be somewhat mundane, and I'll just share a really, really brief story of one that I didn't realize until recently was actually an example of a blessing. But my son, who had been studying in college, our son, been studying biochemistry and neuroscience. And he was on track doing all the lab work and going to Chicago to make presentations or whatever. He came home in his junior year of college and asked to go on a camping trip. And around the campfire, he asked, and I knew this was the whole reason for the camping trip. He said, "Dad, would it be all right with you?" And there's a longer story behind this. But he said, instead of becoming a neuroscientist or a biochemist, and he knew how much weight I attached to that in terms of the power and the prestige and the wealth that might follow that. You know, just so many things that I could be so proud of, say, my son, the neuroscientist, or my son, the biochemist. He said, "Dad, what if I were to become a farmer instead?" And I knew in that moment he was asking me to endorse his decision to leave biochemistry and neuroscience and move in a direction of farming, which was a pretty big move. And I realized in that moment I could make or break his psyche in terms of how he was going to move forward in that direction. And I'm thankful that I did the right thing and just said, "Son, if you want to be a farmer, just promise me you'll be the very best farmer." And it's worked out really well. But I think blessings sometimes come in the form of holy endorsements.
Yes.
And encouragements and aligning with a vision or a passion that your son or your grandson or your granddaughter or your daughter may come to you and say, "Can you endorse this?" And it may not seem natural or what you would have expected, but sometimes even that mundane moment is an opportunity for
Sure.
a powerful blessing.
Okay, that's the movie October Sky. You've seen that?
I don't like it. Sorry.
October Sky. It's a true story of a man in a coal mine town in Kentucky. Had a son, and all he wanted his son to do was get down in the mine and live there in that town and continue the legacy of mining coal while he hacked up a lung the whole movie. And all the son wanted to do is shoot off rockets. And he got really good at it. And he perfected rockets, won a science contest, won a scholarship, and became a NASA engineer. And it wasn't until the latter part of the movie that the father, the coal miner, really looked at his son and realized, I need to bless what he wants to do because there's such tension between us. I need to endorse what my son wants to do. Remember, you and I are called to love our children and grandchildren equally, but uniquely. They're different. There's no way to answer any of these questions in some general answer. Every one of these kids is different. They have a different background, different take, different perspective, different wants and needs, just like you and I do. And remember this, this is a whole night conversation in and of itself. Jesus says, remember the celebrations and observe the feasts. You know, that's a big deal to him. Look at the Hispanic culture. They have the quinceañera when a girl turns 15. The Jewish people have the bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah at 13. There are rites of passages for kids that maybe even we as grandparents need to sort of observe or even create that celebrate a child through the progression of their life at certain ages and recognizes them as sort of becoming men and women. And if we could get behind that, I was talking with a kid the other day and counseling with him, and his parents are they're separated, and he's acting out and getting in trouble and stuff. And he's only 13, and I looked at him. I said, dude, I said, listen, I said, it's time. I said, I know you got a lot on you, but it's time. And he looked up at me. He goes, what do you mean it's time? And I said, it's time to move a little bit closer to manhood and a little bit further from boyhood. And your family needs you to do that right now. It's kind of a raw deal, but it's time. They need you, and I need you to rise above what you're doing right now. He's getting in trouble. And I looked at the kid's face, and he was like, wow, thank you for telling me that. That's what I need to do. I need to become a man. Well, we need to celebrate those kind of things in our kids' lives and our grandchild's life, you know? These milestones. I think it's important. It's a great role for a grandparent anyway. At least I hope it is.
So we have a little bit of time left tonight, and we wanted to give you a chance not just to hear us talk and respond to these questions. And so we have a microphone that we would like to offer as your opportunity to share either some thoughts or questions, insights, observations, whatever it may be from your own personal experience, or just things that you're perhaps curious about. So would encourage you, if you have a question, a comment, just raise your hand and Lisa will bring you the microphone.
Well, that was easy.
I think, Ann, Ann has her hand up right here.
You know, you talk about getting the permission to speak into their lives. Having been through a similar course to this, the one thing that they really stressed was that you share your story with them, because your story is unique to you and their family, and if you can tie the grandparents and great-grandparents, kids really seem to want to understand their place in the world and their place with where values and traditions tie them to other generations. But your story of faith is not about arguing about current events or even theology for that matter. It's just how God has blessed your life and how then you can relate that to blessing them and accepting them. But your story is what's unique, and it's something they're interested in and want to hear.
That's a great point, Ann, because yesterday our daughter called us. Of course, you know, when you have a conversation on the road, it's really 12 conversations because you lose the call. But she's in Los Angeles, and she's on Ancestry.com, and she's calling to verify some information. She says, Dad, was your grandmother and grandfather, were they married in Vegas? I said, what? We're in Brevard, you know. I said, Vegas? I go, I don't think so, no. They were married in Detroit. Well, my grandmother married a second time. Well, my daughter's looking at the wedding license, the marriage license. It says, no, they got married in 1977. I said, oh, that's her second husband. Yeah, they did get married in Vegas. And I thought, what's going on? This went on for an hour and a half, 12 different phone calls. And she had all the documents of our family history, and a picture of me in 5th grade was on the internet. And she goes, Dad, you look so dorky. I go, yeah, honey, thanks for that. That was me, yeah. And she goes, your dad, I see him, he was at Hazel Park High School in Detroit. She says, I have his picture right here. It's at Ancestry.com. He goes, he was good looking.
What happened?
Yeah, yeah. So your point is very well made. We have tools available to us, if our children and grandchildren don't afford themselves to them, to where we can provide more of a history than maybe we could years ago. And you're right. To know who you are, oftentimes we need to know who we come from. I was watching 60 Minutes a few weeks back, and there was this African-American family in Virginia that always got together for a family reunion. Like, you know, that part of our culture does a really good job of that. I was just in a hotel in Atlanta the other day, and the whole hotel was one family. They took up the whole hotel. I felt like an outsider big time. Well, anyway, one of the people in the family says to the other, why don't we call our brother out in California and see if he'll help buy this farm that we keep passing, and we'll use that farm to have our family reunions. It'll hold everybody, and it's a big place. And they called the guy out in California. He goes, yeah, well, let's look at it. Well, they had grown up around this farm their whole entire life and decided, yeah, they were all going to go in on it, and they bought this farm, this big white farmhouse with all this land. Come to find out, all of their ancestors from their family were slaves on that very farm and were buried in the backyard in unmarked graves and lived in the slave house back behind the farmhouse. Now their family reunions are taking place on the very place. And they got to know all of their ancestors that lived there. Fascinating. We have a deep need to be connected, and that's a great way to do it. Ancestry.com, 23andMe, all of that stuff. Fantastic. Very good.
I just know that, like, our daughter loves to hear about my father and Kevin's father and what they did in World War II and
Mm-hmm.
just all of those things that, I don't even know if they study World War II anymore, but it just does connect, but even more than your family ancestry, your how God personally guided your faith journey and what it meant to you personally, or how it changed your life. Because that's something nobody can question or argue with. So it's not one of those landmines that you step
Sure,
on,
yeah.
going into theology and questioning, is this right or wrong? This is just what it is and what it meant to me, and I think they're very interested in that.
Yes. If you have someone in your family that was involved in World War II, for instance, you can go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. They have a whole section of the facility there where they research your ancestor and pull up every record and every, sometimes once top secret, write-up on what that loved one in your family did in the war. And they provide it to you in a binder, a leather binder. It's fantastic. I've seen people do it in this church and learn more about their family in World War II than anything. It's fascinating. So there's all kind of tools out there for that.
This is a really great point, that ancestry can lead to inroads into history, which leads into story, which can lead to testimony, which is a really great progression. You start in a somewhat neutral territory, generations out, and work your way back to the present and to where things become relevant and real. And so it's a wonderful way to enter into that conversation without starting at that point. So I think it's a great point. We have time, I think, for at least one more question or comment. Anyone? Yes. Uh-huh.
So this is something that I've thought about and struggled and tried to unpack. All these young upcoming children and grandchildren, there is a certain amount of nature versus nurture. And there is a disposition in their gene to be one way or another or different or whatever. I'm not talking, sexually. I'm talking about, being mean or being dismissive or being, so what is the percentage of, you guys know that we've adopted kids, we don't have their total background, and, for us, that's something that we walk through every day. But having studied a lot of families that have adopted kids, it seems like that nature wins over the nurture more times than none. And no matter how great the household is, the kids just turn straight. Maybe you can speak into that.
Yeah, I think there's a huge, huge awareness we need to have, adopted or not adopted, on labels. I think a child will gravitate towards a label more often than not. So if we pigeon, not that you are, but if we pigeonhole a child to be a certain temperament or a certain personality, they'll grow towards that if left alone. Not only like we identify with shame in a culture by labeling people in versus different lifestyles and whatnot. I think that's part of adoption, and that's what makes people who adopt children that much more special to me. There has to be a divine flexibility to accept somebody where they are, and not know totally who they are, which is interesting. But I would accentuate, if I was in that situation, whether it's right or not, I don't know, I'd have to think about it. I would accentuate the fact that my temperament, my perception, my values, my way of living has changed as I've become, I wouldn't use the word sanctified, but as I grow in Christ. There is a uniqueness, that's an undeniable uniqueness, but there's also a sameness that comes as Christ comes to inhabit a person's life, and their temperament, and their approach, and their perception of life, that transcends their past, or their past identity, their past shame, or wantedness, affirmness, validation, whatever it is. That to me would become the focal point. He is the one who does that transformation. But you got to love them right where they're at, which is basically what you said you would do, right? I'm going to talk more about that on Sunday. Actually, it's a pretty interesting topic. I don't know if anybody's going to be interested in listening, but it's going to be interesting for me. How we deal with some things in our culture right now, and how adoption fits into that scenario is going to be very interesting to talk about.
I think you've identified two really strong forces within all of our lives, the nature and the nurture, and it's hopefully what you've heard tonight is not a black and white formulaic approach to do it this way and you'll get this outcome. So I don't know that it's ever as clear as we might like it to be, so that we can better define the parameters of personality and character and why we end up the way we do. But I think that for every case that would say there's such a strong genetic tendency that might not be overcome by even the greatest parenting. There was a study recently, or actually an awareness recently. There were twin sisters who are, I think, in their early 20s now. Both were adopted out of South Korea. You may have seen the story recently. And they were adopted in two different families, and one lived in South Korea, I believe, and the other was adopted somewhere in North America. And somehow they reconnected and found each other and realized that even though they were identical twins, so shared a stronger sense of genetics, they were vastly different in terms of their character and personality and intellect. And so it's hard to pin more weight on genetics or nature than nurture and environment and what we're brought up in. So it's difficult to say with any kind of absoluteness, but the fact that we all are adopted ourselves into the kingdom, we each come with our own histories. Back to history, we each come with our own set of genetics, our own experiences, our own good, bad, and everything in between that shape us and mold us. And I think what we're talking about tonight is a way to positively engage so as to have an impact toward the ultimate outcome of what will result as our child or grandchild. And so it's recognizing the genetics, but also recognizing the strong influence of the environment and how we raise them and how we engage with them. So I think that's a great question and comment kind of to wrap up on.
Yeah.
That works.
Good luck with that.
Good luck to all of us. I mean, we're all in that process, in one way or another, I think is important to recognize. So we spoke the first meeting about kind of the cultural, generational context of what this is all about. Tonight is obviously not trying to answer all the questions related to the relational, but just making sure that we understand the questions and the important aspects of the different things we've talked about. The next meeting we have, and I think we'll go ahead and shoot for next Wednesday, would get more on the personal. So we'll move from cultural to relational to the personal, and continue in this discussion. We hope you can come back and continue in this. Invite some others that you think might share an interest in this. And we will look forward as these feed and influence sermon messages on Sunday, and we continue the conversation into Wednesday. So we'll look forward to regrouping and continuing the conversation next Wednesday.
Let me ask a question by show of hands. Was it fairly easy for you to identify in your relationships whether or not estranged, external, or engaged? Yeah. Did you like what you came up with? Okay, we got some no's. Oh, great. Yeah, that's not good. I'm just going to assume you don't like being engaged. So, I'm just kidding. Let's close in prayer. Thank you, Father, that one generation can commend your works to another, and that we do have a story. We all have a story in his story. We all matter. We're all part of a bigger story than our own family even. And we just want to be better, more sensitive, more loving, more caring, more demonstrative, more authentic. We just want to love, that's all. We just want to be there. We want to contribute. So whatever has breached or severed or walled that opportunity off, we ask your Spirit to help us to reconcile. To whatever extent we are engaged, that you give us wisdom, timely wisdom, to know when, Lord, to share and to be vulnerable and when to trust. All we want is the best for our grandchildren and children, and we want you to be glorified. So help us in that. None of us has it figured out but you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, blessings upon you.